My husband's family invited me to a holiday gathering, but once we arrived, they pretended I didn't exist. I didn't want to go. I knew what I'd walk into. The Winters family estate loomed before us, a sprawling Victorian mansion draped in twinkling lights that did nothing to warm its imposing presence. Snow crunched beneath the tires as David pulled our modest sedan up the circular driveway, parking it between a gleaming Audi and a brand-new Range Rover. I glanced down at my outfit, a burgundy dress I'd carefully selected from my rapidly dwindling professional wardrobe, and felt my stomach knot. "You look beautiful," David said, squeezing my hand. The gold of his wedding band caught the light. "It'll be fine, Eliza. They're just adjusting." Adjusting. That was one word for it. Another might be gloating. 2 years ago, I would have walked into this house with my head high, greeting the Winters clan as an equal. Back when Eliza Morgan was a name that meant something in the business world. Back when my boutique marketing agency was the darling of the tech sector. Back when David's family actually bothered to learn how to pronounce my last name.
Now
I was just David's wife. The failure. The disappointment. "Let's get this over with," I said, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. The front door opened before we had a chance to ring the bell. Margaret Winters, David's mother, stood framed in the doorway, regal in an emerald dress that probably cost more than our monthly rent. Her eyes flicked over David with warm approval before sliding past me as if I were made of smoke. "David, darling." She pulled him into an embrace, her diamond-encrusted fingers clutching his shoulders. "You've kept us waiting. Come in, come in. Everyone's in the great room." I followed them into the warm, perfumed interior of the house, invisible in Margaret's wake. The entryway opened into a grand foyer where a 12-foot Christmas tree stood, dripping with ornaments that I knew for a fact were Swarovski crystal. Voices and laughter echoed from deeper in the house. "Mom, you remember Eliza," David said, his hand finding the small of my back. Margaret's smile tightened, a brief flash of acknowledgement that was gone before it fully formed. "Of course. Merry Christmas." She turned to David without missing a beat. "Your father's been asking about that Porter account. He's quite eager to hear how you closed the deal." And just like that, I ceased to exist. I stood in the marble-floored foyer, clutching my small gift bag as they disappeared around the corner. I'd spent hours selecting those tiny bottles of artisanal maple syrup, remembering how Margaret had once mentioned liking it during a brunch 2 years ago. Back when she'd still been trying to impress me, the rising star entrepreneur who'd somehow capture her son's heart. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," came a voice from the staircase. Caroline, David's younger sister, descended with the graceful confidence that came from never having failed at anything in her life. Her blonde hair was twisted into an elegant updo, her black dress simple but unmistakably designer. "Hello, Caroline," I said, summoning warmth into my voice. "Merry Christmas." She gave me a quick, perfunctory hug, the kind you give to distant relatives you're obligated to acknowledge. "Merry Christmas. That's a nice dress." Her eyes lingered on the hemline where I'd hastily mended a small tear the night before. "Vintage. Something like that," I replied, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. "Well, come on then. Better not keep everyone waiting." She turned and walked away, not checking to see if I followed. I took a deep breath and stepped into the great room where the entire Winters clan had gathered. David's father, Richard, holding court by the fireplace. His brother, James, and his wife, Vivian, lounging on the leather sofa. Cousins, aunts, uncles. All of them dressed impeccably, all of them part of a world I once thought I'd earned my place in. David was already deep in conversation with his father, gesturing animatedly as he described some business triumph. He didn't look up as I entered. "Eliza." It was Aunt Patrice, the family's black sheep who'd married a jazz musician in the 80s. She was the only one who seemed genuinely pleased to see me. "Come sit with me, dear. Tell me how you've been." I made my way to her corner, grateful for the lifeline. As I settled beside her, I caught snippets of conversation from around the room. Complete collapse of the sector? Heard they had to lay off everyone. living off David's salary now. I kept my smile fixed in place as Patrice chatted about her grandchildren. Across the room, I watched as Margaret gathered everyone for pre-dinner drinks, crystal flutes of champagne being distributed on silver trays. I counted 1, 2, 3. She was one glass short. When the tray reached me, it was empty. "Oh, Eliza," Margaret said with exaggerated dismay. "I'm so sorry. We seem to be one short. Would you mind getting yourself something from the bar? There's some Prosecco there, I believe."
"Not champagne. Prosecco."
I nodded pleasantly and stood, making my way to the bar cart in the corner. As I poured myself a drink, I caught my reflection in the ornate mirror hanging above it. I barely recognized the woman staring back at me, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes wary, smile uncertain. Where was the confident CEO who once commanded boardrooms? Where was the woman who'd built something from nothing, who'd earned respect through sheer will and intelligence? She was here, somewhere, beneath the layers of humiliation and defeat. I straightened my spine and raised my chin. For a moment, our eyes met across the room, David's and mine. There was a question in his gaze, a flicker of concern. Then his father clapped him on the shoulder, and he turned away, laughing at some joke I couldn't hear. I raised my glass of Prosecco in a silent toast to my reflection. They think this is all that's left of me, I thought. They have no idea. The dinner bell rang, a delicate silver chime that cut through the conversation. As the family began to migrate toward the dining room, I lingered behind, taking a moment to compose myself for the next act in this holiday charade. I didn't want to be here. I knew what I'd walked into, but they had no idea what they'd invited into their home. To them, I'm no longer worthy of their name. The Winters family dining room was a study in old money elegance, crystal chandelier hovering over a mahogany table that could seat 20, walls adorned with oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors, and place settings that included more silverware than most people owned in their entire homes. I stood in the doorway, scanning the elaborate place cards until I found mine. It wasn't next to David. In fact, it wasn't anywhere near the center of the table where the core family sat. My name, scrawled in Margaret's perfect calligraphy, marked a spot near the far end, between Cousin Philip, who collected taxidermy and smelled perpetually of mothballs, and David's great-aunt Meredith, whose hearing aid whistled like a tea kettle. Seating arrangements, Margaret announced to the room, are according to family tradition. Our eyes met briefly. We both knew there was no such tradition. This was calculated, a physical representation of my place in the hierarchy. Outside the inner circle, an afterthought. I took my seat with a gracious smile that made my face ache. David, seated between his mother and sister at the head of the table, caught my eye and gave a small shrug as if to say, "What can you do?"
"Plenty," I thought.
You could do plenty, but he wouldn't. That had become painfully clear over the past year. My loving, supportive husband had slowly morphed back into a Winters, retreating into the protective bubble of family privilege as my world crumbled. He hadn't fought for me in months. Why would tonight be any different? "So, Eliza," Great-Aunt Meredith shouted, her hearing aid screeching, "David tells us you're still looking for work." Conversations around us dimmed. I could feel eyes shifting in my direction, measuring my reaction. "I'm consulting," I replied evenly. "Building a new client base takes time." Consulting. James, David's brother, called from his place of honor near their father. That's what they call unemployment these days, isn't it? He winked at me, as if we were sharing a joke rather than him publicly humiliating me. Laughter rippled around the table. Not from everyone. Aunt Patrice shot me a sympathetic look, and a few of the younger cousins seemed uncomfortable. But enough. Enough to make heat rise to my face. "Actually," I said, my voice steady despite the anger bubbling beneath my skin, "I've been quite selective about my projects. Quality over quantity." "How sensible," Margaret said, her tone suggesting it was anything but. Though I imagine after such a spectacular downturn, any work would be welcome. David cleared his throat. "Mom, Eliza's agency was hit by market forces beyond anyone's control. The whole sector crashed. It was the closest thing to a defense I'd heard from him in months, and yet it still fell short. Market forces beyond anyone's control. As if I hadn't seen the crash coming. As if I hadn't tried to pivot the company while there was still time. As if I hadn't begged our investors, some of whom were friends with the Winters family, for a little more runway. Of course, Richard, David's father, intoned from the head of the table. No one suggesting otherwise. Still, it's the mark of a true business mind to anticipate market corrections, isn't it? That's how the Winters name has endured for 3 generations. The first course arrived, saving me from having to respond. Butternut squash soup, garnished with a delicate sage leaf. I reached for my spoon, only to find my water glass tipping over. Caroline's arm had accidentally bumped it while reaching for the bread basket.
Oh.
"I'm so sorry," she exclaimed, not sounding sorry at all as water soaked the tablecloth near my place setting. "How clumsy of me." "It's fine," I said, quickly blotting the spill with my napkin. "No harm done." "Let me help," I heard myself offer as servers began to clear the first course. A reflex from my childhood, when being useful was the only currency I had. "That won't be necessary," Margaret replied, her dismissive wave saying more than her words. "The staff know what they're doing." "Unlike you," her eyes seemed to add. I sat back, chastened, as the main course was served. Prime rib, roasted potatoes, Haricot's verts with almonds, a meal I would have savored under different circumstances. Now each bite felt like an obligation. "Those are interesting shoes," I heard Caroline say to Vivian, though her voice was pitched to carry down the table to me. "Target, do you think? Or maybe Payless?" I glanced down at my black heels, purchased in the final days before my company's bankruptcy. Still elegant, still well-made, though admittedly showing signs of wear after 2 years as my only formal footwear. "More like Goodwill," Vivian replied with a snicker. "But you know how it is with these career women who can't hold it together. One minute they're buying Louboutins, the next they're dumpster diving." My jaw clenched so hard, I thought my teeth might crack. David, seated within earshot, became intensely interested in cutting his meat. "You know what I've always found fascinating?" I said clearly, interrupting their snide exchange. "How quickly people forget that circumstances can change for anyone. Today's success can become tomorrow's cautionary tale, and vice versa." The table fell momentarily silent. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, his fork pausing halfway to his mouth. "Is that a threat, Eliza?" Margaret asked, laughing as if the very idea was absurd. "Not at all," I replied, my smile never wavering. "Just an observation from someone who's seen both sides." "Well," she continued, raising her wine glass, "let's hope the only change in circumstance for the Winters family is continued prosperity." "To family legacy. To family legacy," everyone echoed. Everyone except me. I took a sip of my water instead, my mind drifting to the folder hidden in my purse. To the meetings I'd been taking while consulting. To the names on documents that would make these people choke on their expensive wine if they knew.
They thought they'd buried me.
They thought I was powerless. They had no idea what was coming. They forgot I used to sit in boardrooms with sharks. After dinner, the Winters family migrated to the grand parlor for dessert and coffee. I lingered behind, taking a moment to compose myself in the empty dining room. Through the doorway, I could see them all, laughing, clinking glasses, secure in their fortress of wealth and connection. They looked untouchable, but I knew better. I slipped my phone from my purse and checked my messages. A text from Alex, my former CFO, and one of the few who'd stuck by me through the collapse. They just signed the preliminary papers. "We're set for the announcement tomorrow. You sure about this timing?" I typed back quickly, "Absolutely. Proceed as planned." When my marketing agency, Morgan Digital, went under, it wasn't just bad luck or poor timing. There had been deliberate moves against us, accounts mysteriously pulled, investors suddenly backing out, rumors of instability that seemed to come from nowhere. For months, I'd been too devastated to see the pattern. Too busy blaming myself. Until I found the email. It had been buried in a folder of documents my assistant had salvaged before we closed the office. An exchange between Richard Winters and Grayson Porter, my biggest investor, dated 3 weeks before he pulled his funding. The Morgan situation has become untenable, Richard had written. David needs to focus on the family business, not playing supportive husband to a wife who's getting too much attention. The distraction ends now. Porter's response had been equally damning. Considered handled. The market's volatile enough that no one will question another startup folding. They hadn't just watched me fail. They'd orchestrated it. I tucked my phone away as David appeared in the doorway. "There you are," he said, relief evident in his voice. "Mom's serving her famous chocolate mousse." "Wouldn't miss it," I replied, plastering on a smile. I rose from my chair and joined him, his hand resting lightly on my back as we walked. The parlor was warm and festive, with a fire crackling in the marble fireplace and soft jazz playing in the background. The younger cousins were sprawled on the floor playing a board game, while the older generation occupied the armchairs and sofas. I was directed to a hardback chair near the edge of the room, like an afterthought. Margaret moved through the space with practiced grace, serving dessert on heirloom china. When she reached me, she hesitated, as if surprised to find me still there. "Oh, Eliza. Would you like some mousse?" she asked, the spoon hovering uncertainly over the bowl. "Please," I said. "Your desserts are always extraordinary, Margaret." She blinked, perhaps searching for sarcasm in my compliment. Finding none, she served me a noticeably smaller portion than everyone else had received. "That's kind of you to say." "I've always admired your attention to detail," I continued conversationally. "In everything you do." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "It's the hallmark of good breeding, I suppose." "Or good training," I countered. "I've found that the most valuable skills can be acquired, not just inherited." Richard had materialized beside his wife, his hand possessively on her shoulder. "Some things can't be taught, though, can they? Either you're born with certain advantages or you aren't." "That's certainly what privileged people like to believe," I replied, my tone light despite the challenge in my words. A moment of tense silence followed. Then Richard chuckled, a sound with no warmth in it. "Spirited as ever, Eliza. I'll give you that." As they moved away, I caught David watching me, a crease between his brows. He knew me well enough to sense when I was holding something back. But he didn't approach, just turned his attention to James, who was loudly recounting his latest golfing triumph. I ate my mousse slowly, savoring each bite while I observed the family dynamics playing out before me. Caroline and Vivian huddled in a corner, periodically glancing my way and giggling. Margaret efficiently directed the household staff while maintaining her role as the perfect hostess. Richard held court near the fireplace, dispensing business wisdom to his sons and nephews. They'd built an impenetrable world, insulated by money and social connections. A world they'd allowed me to glimpse only because David had brought me into it, and only as long as I'd been successful enough to reflect well on them. What they'd never understood was that I hadn't clawed my way up from nothing by being naive. After my company collapsed, while I was ostensibly licking my wounds and consulting, I'd been investigating, connecting dots, making calls to old contacts in the financial sector. And what I'd uncovered about Winters Holdings had been illuminating. The family business was in trouble. Serious trouble. Years of complacency and poor investments had left them vulnerable. Their cash reserves were dwindling, and they'd been quietly selling off assets to maintain appearances. The only thing keeping them afloat was their reputation and one final valuable asset, the Riverside Development, a waterfront property they'd purchased decades ago for a fraction of its current worth. And now that asset was in play. My phone vibrated again. Another text from Alex. "The lawyers are finalizing the press release. Confirming you want the partners named explicitly?" I glanced up. Across the room, Richard was pontificating about legacy and tradition. David was nodding along, eager for his father's approval. Margaret was smiling benevolently at her dynasty. None of them had any idea that I'd spent the past 6 months assembling an investment group composed primarily of women entrepreneurs who'd faced similar market forces to acquire the Riverside property, or that I'd leveraged my remaining contacts to ensure our bid was positioned perfectly, or that I'd kept my name out of the paperwork until the very last minute. I texted back, yes. Full transparency. Aunt Patrice settled into the chair beside me, offering a conspiratorial smile. "You've got that look," she said, her voice low. "The one that says you're plotting something delicious." I smiled back at the family rebel. "I don't know what you mean." "Oh, please." She waved her dessert spoon dismissively. I recognized the signs. I wore that same expression the day I told this family I was marrying a jazz musician with no prospects. She leaned closer. "Whatever it is, I hope it's spectacular." I sipped my coffee, watching as David's father raised his glass in yet another toast to family excellence. Everyone joined in. No one looked my way or offered me a glass. "Don't worry," I murmured to Patrice. "It will be." They wanted me to disappear. Instead, I stood up. The evening dragged on, each minute stretching like taffy. Gift exchanges began. Elaborate, expensive presents passed between family members with much fanfare and photography. I sat quietly, the small bag of maple syrup still tucked beside my chair, knowing it would be received with barely concealed disappointment whenever I presented it. "And now," Margaret announced, lifting a crystal flute, "a toast to our wonderful family." Everyone stood, glasses raised. I picked up my water. My wine glass had somehow never been refilled after dinner, and followed suit. "To the Winters legacy," she continued, her gaze sweeping the room but carefully skipping over me. "To Richard, whose business acumen has kept our family prosperous through changing times. To our sons, James and David, who continue to build on their father's success." She paused, briefly acknowledging Vivian. "To our beautiful daughters-in-law, the singular not lost on me, and of course, to all the Winters gathered here tonight. May our family's influence continue to grow." "To the Winters," everyone chorused. I sipped my water silently. No acknowledgement, not even a perfunctory mention. "Now," Richard boomed, "I think it's time for a little family update." He moved to stand before the ornate fireplace, commanding the room like a CEO at a shareholders meeting. "As you all know, this has been a challenging year for many businesses, but Winters Holdings continues to thrive." I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. Thriving was not the word my sources would use to describe their current financial situation. "Our flagship project, the Riverside development, is entering its final phase," Richard continued. "By this time next year, we expect to have completed an agreement that will secure the Winters' legacy for generations to come." James nodded vigorously. "We're in talks with several major players. Bidding is competitive." That was one way of putting it. Another would be desperate. They needed this deal to save the company. David caught my eye from across the room, his expression unreadable. Did he know how precarious his family's finances really were? Or was he as much in the dark as the rest of them seemed to keep him? "I'd like to propose another toast," Caroline interjected, raising her glass. "To new beginnings and fresh starts. Perhaps," her gaze fixed pointedly on me, "some of us might find new directions in the coming year. Paths better suited to our capabilities." The implication was clear as crystal. A not-so-subtle suggestion that I should divorce David or at least stop embarrassing the family with my failed career. Several awkward chuckles followed her toast, with Margaret failing to hide a small smile of approval. That was it. The final straw. "Would you all excuse me for a moment?" I said, rising from my chair. No one acknowledged my departure as I slipped from the room. In the hallway, I leaned against the wall, taking deep breaths. My phone buzzed again, another text from Alex. "Everything's set. Press release goes out at 9 a.m. tomorrow. Sure you don't want to wait until after the holidays?" I checked the time, 9:47 p.m. In less than 12 hours, the news would break officially. But there was no reason the Winters family couldn't get a preview. Proceeding as planned, I texted back. Then I added, "Actually, can you send me the final investor list and acquisition summary? I have a family situation that could benefit from early disclosure." Alex's response came quickly. "You're the boss. Documents incoming." I waited by the hall table as the email arrived, quickly downloading the attached files. Then, Straightening my shoulders, I walked back toward the parlor with renewed purpose. On my way, I detoured through the media room, picking up the remote control for the enormous smart TV that dominated one wall. When I returned to the parlor, a heated discussion was underway. No one noticed as I slipped back in and quietly took my seat. No one except David, whose eyes followed me with growing suspicion. I waited for a natural lull in the conversation before clearing my throat. I'd like to offer a toast as well, if I may. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to me with various degrees of surprise and annoyance. Actually, I amended, standing and moving toward the TV, perhaps more of an announcement. Or maybe a gift. I smiled. A late Christmas present, if you will. "Eliza," David said, a warning note in his voice. He knew that smile. It was the one I'd worn in boardrooms just before closing impossible deals. "What are you doing?" Margaret asked, her hostess smile strained at the edges. "Sharing some exciting news," I replied, turning on the TV. I connected my phone and pulled up the press release Alex had sent, projecting it onto the massive screen. Breaking: Riverside Development acquired by Phoenix Ventures. The headline hung there in bold text, causing a confused murmur through the room. "What is this?" Richard demanded, squinting at the screen. "The future of the Riverside Development," I said calmly. "I thought you'd want to be the first to know, given how important it is to your legacy." I scrolled down to the list of investment partners behind Phoenix Ventures, a consortium I'd quietly helped assemble over the past 6 months. And there, nestled among the names of women entrepreneurs and venture capitalists, was a newly added entry. Morgan Digital Holdings E. Morgan, principal partner. The room fell so silent, I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the foyer. "That's not possible," James finally sputtered. "The Riverside deal isn't finalized. We have multiple bidders." I corrected gently. "The board voted this afternoon. Phoenix Ventures presented the most compelling offer." I turned to face Richard directly. Apparently, they were concerned about Winters Holdings' financial stability. Something about over-leveraged assets and cash flow problems. The color drained from Richard's face. "You. Me." I agreed. "Surprised? You really shouldn't be. After all, you taught me an invaluable lesson last year about how business really works." I stepped closer, my voice dropping so only he could hear. "I found the emails, Richard, between you and Grayson Porter, about how my company had become a distraction for David." He recoiled as if I'd slapped him. I turned back to the stunned room, raising my water glass in a toast. To new beginnings. And to karmic justice, which isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's just a quiet woman they thought they buried, rising higher than they ever dreamed. They finally saw me, and they hated it. The silence that followed my announcement was absolute. You could have heard a snowflake land outside. Every face in the room registered a different shade of shock, Margaret's elegant features frozen in disbelief, James's mouth hanging slightly open, Caroline's eyes narrowed in calculation. And David stared at me like he was seeing a stranger. Richard recovered first, forcing a laugh that sounded like glass breaking. "This is preposterous. A joke in very poor taste, Eliza." "Is it?" I tapped my phone, scrolling to the next document, a formal letter from Winters Holdings Board of Directors, which one of my new partners had helpfully leaked to me. "Your board doesn't seem to think so. They've been quietly looking for buyers for months. Something about concerning liquidity issues and potential insolvency risks." Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her pearl necklace. "Richard?" He ignored her, his focus laser-sharp on me. "Whatever you think you've done is completely legal and above board." I finished for him. "Unlike what you did to me." "I don't know what you're talking about," he blustered, but his eyes darted nervously to David. I reached into my purse and withdrew a folded sheet of paper, a printout of the email that had changed everything. "Shall I read it aloud? Or would you prefer to explain to your family how you colluded with my biggest investor to tank my company because my success was becoming inconvenient for your son?" The room erupted in confused murmurs. David pushed through the crowd toward me, his face a storm of conflicting emotions. Eliza, what are you saying? I handed him the email without a word, watched as he scanned it, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to something darker.
Dad.
His voice cracked slightly as he looked up from the paper. Tell me this isn't real. Richard's face had gone the mottled red of someone on the verge of a cardiac event. It's being taken out of context. Your wife's company was failing anyway. I simply accelerated the inevitable. To protect the family, Margaret added quickly, moving to stand beside her husband. David was spending so much time helping with her business instead of focusing on Winter's holdings. And that justifies sabotage? David's voice rose. Destroying someone's livelihood? Her dream? James edged forward, ever the pragmatist. Let's all calm down. Whatever happened in the past is done. What matters now is this. Phoenix Ventures situation. He turned to me, attempting a conciliatory smile that came off as a grimace. Eliza, surely we can discuss this like family. There must be some arrangement. Actually, I interrupted. I've brought copies of that arrangement for everyone. I withdrew a stack of folders from my tote bag, the same bag they'd all assumed contained only cheap, embarrassing gifts. The Riverside acquisition will proceed as outlined here. Phoenix Ventures will assume control of the property effective January 1st. Margaret snatched a folder, flipping through it with trembling hands. This is outrageous. Our lawyers will. Your lawyers have already reviewed and approved it, I said. Your board members signed off this afternoon. It's done, Margaret. Caroline pushed forward, her perfect face twisted with fury. You vindictive bitch. You've been planning this all along, haven't you? Playing the victim while plotting against us. Against you? I raised an eyebrow. No, Caroline. I've been fighting to survive after your family tried to destroy me. There's a difference. I turned to face the whole room. The truth is, Winter's Holdings has been mismanaged for years. Your legacy is built on outdated connections and status anxiety, not sound business principles. The Riverside property is the only thing keeping you afloat, and even that was slipping away before Phoenix made our offer. So this is revenge, Richard spat. You're taking everything from us. Not everything, I corrected. Just what you were about to lose anyway. And I'm not taking it, I'm transforming it. I gestured to the presentation still displayed on the TV screen, advancing to the development plans. Phoenix Ventures isn't going to build another soulless luxury development. We're creating a mixed-use space with affordable housing components, green technology incubators, and community facilities. David moved closer, studying the plans with growing interest. This is actually brilliant. We think so, I agreed. And profitable, in ways your father's team never considered. You won't get away with this, Margaret hissed, but her voice lacked conviction. Aunt Patrice let out a delighted cackle from her corner of the room. Oh, I think she already has Maggie. And it's about time someone shook up this family's delusions of grandeur. The room split into factions then, some family members demanding explanations from Richard, others approaching me with newfound respect or thinly veiled hostility. James was already on his phone, presumably calling their lawyers to confirm what I'd told them. Caroline stormed out, Vivian trailing in her wake. Through it all, David remained by my side, silent and thoughtful. I could feel the weight of his gaze, could almost hear the recalibration happening in his mind as he reassessed everything he thought he knew about his family, about me, about himself. Finally, he spoke. Why didn't you tell me? His voice was quiet, meant only for me amid the chaos we'd created. Would you have believed me? I asked, meeting his eyes directly. Would you have stood against your father if I'd shown you that email 6 months ago? His silence was answer enough. I needed to be sure, I continued, of what I was capable of what they were capable of, and of where you would stand when the truth came out. Richard's voice cut through the din. This isn't over, Eliza. Not by a long shot. I turned to face my father-in-law, feeling strangely calm in the eye of the storm I'd created. You're right, Richard. It's not over. It's just beginning. The difference is, this time I'm not walking into your game blindfolded. I'm changing the rules. I felt David's hand touch mine. Not grabbing, not possessive, just a tentative point of contact. A question. The Winters family had finally seen me. Really seen me. And they hated what they saw. Not a broken woman they could dismiss, but a force they had gravely underestimated. The reckoning had only just begun. I walked and ignored. I walked out unforgettable. The remainder of the evening unfolded like a surreal dream. The carefully orchestrated holiday gathering had fractured into chaos, hushed arguments in corners, furtive phone calls, glasses of scotch poured with shaking hands. The younger cousins had been shooed upstairs, while the adults grappled with the implications of what I'd revealed. I sat calmly in the same hardback chair I'd been relegated to all evening, though no one dared ignore me now. Every few minutes, someone would approach with questions, thinly veiled threats, or awkward attempts at reconciliation. "You know," James said, sidling up to me with a fresh drink in hand, "I always respected your business acumen. Perhaps there's a role for me in this Phoenix Ventures of yours?" I smiled politely. "Submit your resume. We have a thorough vetting process." He blanched at the suggestion that he would need to apply like anyone else. Margaret had retreated to the kitchen, ostensibly to oversee dessert, but more likely to avoid facing the reality of her family's situation. Through the doorway, I could see her gripping the marble countertop, her knuckles white. Richard remained by the fireplace, his earlier bluster replaced by grim calculation. I recognized that look from my own business dealings. He was already plotting countermoves, looking for weaknesses in my position. Let him try. Every document was airtight, every decision board approved. The mighty Richard Winters had been outmaneuvered, and he knew it. Across the room, David was engaged in intense conversation with his father. Their voices were low, but their body language spoke volumes. David leaning forward aggressively, Richard's defensive posture, hands raised. For perhaps the first time in his life, David was challenging his father directly. Aunt Patrice appeared at my elbow, offering a crystal tumbler of amber liquid. "You look like you could use this more than that water." I accepted gratefully, taking a small sip of what turned out to be excellent bourbon. "Thank you." "No, thank you," she said with a wink. "Best Christmas entertainment I've had in decades." Her expression softened. Though I imagine it wasn't easy, carrying this alone all these months. "It wasn't," I admitted. "But sometimes you have to walk through fire on your own to figure out what you're made of." She nodded, understanding in her eyes. She'd been the family's black sheep long before I arrived. "And what about him?" She nodded toward David. I watched my husband across the room, his shoulders set in a determined line I hadn't seen in months. "That's up to him now." As the clock approached midnight, Margaret finally emerged from the kitchen, her composure regained through sheer force of will. "It's getting late," she announced, her voice only slightly strained. "Perhaps we should call it a night." No one argued. The usual elaborate farewells were condensed into awkward nods and mumbled goodnights as family members gathered their coats and gifts. I noticed several of them checking their phones nervously, no doubt contacting financial advisors despite the late hour. Caroline approached as I collected my things, Vivian hovering behind her. Her perfect makeup couldn't hide the redness around her eyes. "I hope you're satisfied," she said, voice low. "You've ruined Christmas." "No, Caroline," I replied evenly. "I just changed the narrative. There's a difference." Vivian stepped forward, surprising me with what appeared to be genuine remorse. "For what it's worth, I didn't know about what Richard did to your company." "Few did," I acknowledged, "but many benefited from looking the other way." She nodded, accepting the gentle rebuke, and tugged Caroline toward the door before she could say something worse. As the house emptied, I found myself standing alone in the grand foyer, surrounded by the trappings of wealth and privilege that had once intimidated me. The massive Christmas tree with its perfect ornaments, the oil paintings of Stern Winter's ancestors, the marble floors and crystal chandeliers. It all seemed smaller somehow, less imposing. Richard appeared at the entrance to the study, drink in hand. We regarded each other silently, adversaries who had finally shown their true capabilities. "You won't last, you know," he said finally. The business world has no patience for sentimentality. Your little community-focused plans for Riverside will fail. Maybe, I conceded. But I'd rather fail honestly than succeed through sabotage and cruelty. His eyes narrowed. This family built something that has lasted generations. And now it's time for something new, I replied. Evolution is necessary for survival, Richard. Even for the Winters dynasty. Before he could respond, David emerged from the study behind his father. He'd removed his tie, and his expression was one of bone-deep exhaustion and clarity. "The car's ready," he said to me, ignoring his father completely. I nodded and gathered my coat. Margaret appeared one last time, handing me the small gift bag of maple syrup I'd brought and forgotten in the drama. "You forgot this," she said stiffly. "Keep it," I replied. "Something to remember me by." Her lips thinned, but she didn't argue. David and I walked to the door together, his hand hovering near, but not quite touching the small of my back. The gesture struck me as symbolic of everything that hung in the balance between us: proximity without connection, intention without commitment. As we stepped outside, the cold December air hit my face like a blessing. Snow had begun to fall again, soft flakes catching in my hair and on my eyelashes. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the clean, sharp scent of winter, of new beginnings. I walked down the steps alone, the snow crunching beneath my boots, the same cheap shoes Caroline and Vivian had mocked hours earlier. Behind me, I heard David exchange a few final words with his parents, their voices tense but too low to make out.
Then footsteps.
Not leading away from me, but following. David caught up as I reached the car, his breath fogging in the cold air between us. "I don't know what happens next," he said honestly, snowflakes melting on his shoulders. "With us. With any of this." "Neither do I admitted. "But for the first time in a long time, I'm excited to find out." He studied my face in the soft glow of the porch lights, seeing, truly seeing, the woman he'd married. Not the broken shell his family had tried to create, nor the business phenom he'd first fallen for. Just me, Eliza, resilient, determined, and finally free of the need for anyone's approval. "You're remarkable," he said quietly, opening the car door for me. I smiled, a real smile that reached my eyes and warmed my chest. "I know." As we drove away from the Winters estate, I didn't look back. There was no need. I had walked in there ignored, a ghost, an embarrassment, an afterthought. I walked out unforgettable. The road ahead was uncertain, full of challenges and consequences from tonight's revelations. But as the snow fell around us and the mansion receded in the rearview mirror, one thing was absolutely clear. I had reclaimed my story, and this time I would be the one telling it.